Well, welcome everybody. I am so excited to announce this year's summer series of podcasts. In the past, I've had a whole lot of experts on over summer, but this year I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be sharing with you insights and inspiration where I'm getting on parents, teachers, French teacher, a secondary school teacher, a whole lot of people, lived experience to share their insights and some inspiration and what's made a difference to them. These are people that have basically reached out to me during the year and gone, I listened to your podcast and said they've had these successes. And I'm like, well, come on the podcast and share. Because I think that summer's a great time to think about the new year, get a little bit of inspiration, but rather than me sending you a whole lot of tips to put in place when you haven't even got the children in your class, this is just like a whole lot of fun in your buds, these earbuds, these are holidays. So please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode because I'm not going to be sending so many emails to remind you. And if you subscribe, then you'll know when the new episode has dropped. So this week we have Jane McFadden sharing her lived experience and clinical experience of ADHD and understanding girls who camouflage their struggles. And it's just a really interesting conversation where she shares a whole of insights and information to help us understand these girls who are so often undiagnosed. As we know, the diagnostic criteria has had a boy bias, and there are many, many women getting diagnosed late in life who tell us what a difference it have made. So Jane's going to share a whole lot of great tips, and some of them are for classrooms, but I do think that's just a great way to listen and get some understanding of our girls. And I recommend teachers reflect on maybe girls you've taught in the past, and maybe if you know who your class is coming up, an opportunity to think about those girls and what you can do straight up to help them feel included and part of your classroom and put in place those supports for them. I wish I'd known a lot more about girls years ago, and I always enjoy hearing Dr. Tony Atwood talk about girls, and Danuta, we have her book, I'm Aspie Girl. You know, there's lots of great resources available, and I have lots of great ADHD resources on my website because some of you might have heard this new term, Audi ADHD, which I will be discussing in a podcast next year. I'm planning to do some more stuff around Audi ADHD, which is autism ADHD. Many of our children have that dual diagnosis, but it's a specific group of children who I'm really interested in. I think understanding that group and what works and what doesn't work will be really, really, really helpful for all of you. If you don't know, I am running some PD days on Friday, January 24th, which for Queensland is your PD day. And I highly recommend that if you want to get some training to start your year, book in now. I'll send you a show bag. Make sure to include your home address if you're going to be learning at home that day. The advantage of a live virtual workshop, you can learn from anywhere. Just so you know, the reviews for my live virtual are as good as my face-to-face. I mean, it depends on your learning style, but I mean, the advantage of live virtual, the last one we had people from all over Australia, from islands off Australia, from all over the place. I just love it. I love it. And thank you if any of you have joined me for live virtuals in 2024. So we're kicking off 2025 with a live virtual on January 24th. But then a whole lot of New South Wales principals and leadership reached out and said, Sue, that's not a PD day for us. Can you do a PD day for New South Wales, which is February 5th? And at first I'm like, what do you mean February 5th? Surely the teachers and students will be back. But apparently not. And we've already got regos coming in for that day. So I highly recommend you think about starting your day off with the training. Getting the supports and information up front makes a world of difference to you as an educator and the children. So I highly recommend think about joining me on those days, and we can invoice your organisation. If you're already on holidays, don't worry, don't need to pay till after the day, but make sure you get registered so I can get those show bags out to you. Well, welcome everybody. I am so excited to have Jane McFadden join us on the podcast. The reason I'm excited to have Jane is she is a former psychologist turned neuroscientist. She's an author and a neurodiversity specialist. But more than anything, she has the lived experience plus clinical experience, which is what I think many teachers want. They want to hear both from someone who has a diagnosis and also has that clinical experience. So Jane is diagnosed with ADHD and more recently autism. And so I'm excited she's going to share with us about girls and camouflaging and the veneer of coping, as I call it. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you. I could not be any more excited, but also disorganized. So that's about standard for me. So thanks for having me, Sue.
That's okay. No, and that disorganization is what people want, their honesty. And I think many of us feel that way. How do you think it might feel different for an ADHD girl or woman, though, being disorganized?
Or as opposed to being autistic as well.
Yeah, well, all of that, I suppose.
Well, personal opinion, I don't believe there are that many straight ADHDers. If we look at the research, there's only 25%. So there is still a lot of stigma with being autistic, and I am very openly autistic, not because I am particularly comfortable, but because I also want to pave the way for a successful woman to be autistic, come across as, and I'm air quoting, normal, and that's okay. So when I see and hear a lot of people talking about ADHD, I am so excited that one day we will get to a point where people will drop autism in the same way that they drop ADHD. And I have no issue with people using ADHD or autism incorrectly. In fact, I embrace it. When people go, oh, that's such an ADHD moment, I get the offense, but I also think how amazing is it that people are dropping it incorrectly, because this is how they will learn. So when people talk about ADHD and time, I usually take a deep breath and think to myself straight away, well, they're probably autistic as well, or they may be, and they probably don't know that yet. So it is a little bit of a pet hate of mine when I hear people talk about ADHD quite loosely, not knowing that they're often talking about something else as well. And that can contribute to a little bit of the misinformation. I love social media. I tell the mums in my podcast, get on there, get the information, educate yourself, absolutely. But we do want to be careful on what we're following. Are we following someone with clinical experience and lived experience? Or are we following an influencer that's just been diagnosed that doesn't actually know anything? Because we want to be really careful with some people who've had a lot of trauma. They're talking about PTSD. They're not talking about ADHD. So for me, one of the things that I really sit with my nerd brain is around what is what, because so many women have been misdiagnosed. So when we're actually looking at helping somebody, what are we dealing with? And sorry, this is my area. I just love it so much.
I'm just listening to you. There's so much we can unpack there. And look, I really like what Tony Attwood says. Without a diagnosis, children are judged. With a diagnosis, they can be supported. Now, this is why I love the word neurodiversity, because as a teacher, I rarely have a child with one diagnosis. It's just not right to think, well, the child's only going to have one diagnosis. You know, when you come into it more like when I show my visual of neurodiversity and I ask teachers to select a student who mightn't have all these different diagnoses, what do they think? And even though we don't diagnose kids, we've normally taught enough kids to know, okay, yep, I can see the ADHD, I can see the OCD, I can see the trauma, which you just brought up with post-traumatic stress. And so I believe as an educator, I need all those bits to give the best support for the child. But what I really want you to talk about the other piece of that, which is the girls, because understanding that girls are I know we've improved, but they're still underdiagnosed, and also knowing that overlap. So what do you think the difference is as a classroom teacher? How would a girl look in my classroom compared to a boy, with ADHD? How would they look different?
Well, this is it. So I suppose we've got to first up acknowledge that there's a lot of ADHDers that are also going to be autistic. However, they are generally not assessed, or it's ruled out quickly. For example, you may get a ped that goes, oh, well, we can rule out autism because Sally's got eye contact. Now,
don't.
I don't want to wind Sue up. But so I suppose for me, I always have a theme around what I do is I say, it isn't about checking if a child is autistic. It's about ruling it out repeatedly. So it's not about, and that's where I think that's where it needs to go. So for me, for teachers and what I see, so I work with ADHD mums all day, every day. But the reason that I'm in this is nothing about, well, it's pure passion really. And I can say that honestly because I've got no need to do the podcast. I've run a very successful psychology company. There's absolutely no financial gain for me at all. But when I was 14, I had the hugest breakdown I've ever had in my entire life. stable upbringing, transition to high school to a great school, and I hit a rock bottom that I've never hit before. Now, people that don't know me might think to themselves, oh, well, you probably haven't gone through something really bad as an adult then. I've lost both parents, very, very traumatic quickly. I've gone through numerous health issues. I've moved states. There has been so much grief and roller coaster as an adult. However, I would never go back to any time in my life with more like just shivers down my spine than when I was 14, because you can't control your environment and you're a child. And I put that entire thing down to autistic burnout, which has been incredibly beneficial for me to do, because I've walked around since I was 14 wondering, what's wrong with me? People think I'm crazy. I am crazy. And I walked around therapist to therapist, medication to medication, nothing helped, except for quiet time alone by myself, which I wasn't allowed to do because back then school can't wasn't a thing. So when I look back to my teenage years and my childhood, I just it kills me to think what could have been avoided. And obviously back then, it couldn't have been avoided. The education wasn't there. You can't wish it away, but I can do more now. And with my daughter and my two sons, I can do more now. And it's not just about them. It's about all of the other children that I come into contact with that need more. And I love teachers. I have so much respect for them. Whenever I walk into a classroom, I always say to the teacher, oh my God, how do you stay here all day? Like, it's such a massive job. So when the pediatrician's there with the assessment tool and the parents are there and the teacher is not seeing anything, and I'm air quoting, it's tough. It is a really tough position to be in. If I was a teacher and I was in their position and I was really wanting to help and back up what the parent is saying to me, but I'm not seeing it, I would be looking for what I call internalized and camouflaging presentation of autism and ADHD. If you have a parent that's there in front of you, I would probably say that you're looking more towards possibly autism, because you're probably seeing those big meltdowns at home where they're holding it together. That is, and just this is my personal opinion, I think when you are looking at a dual diagnosis, you've probably got a lot more there. The parents are a little more desperate. There's often sensory stuff going along. For example, I started talking to the prep teacher about my daughter because I spent 90 minutes putting shoes on her every single morning. And the prep teacher, and I love the prep teacher, she said to me, we just don't see any of that here. And it was, and agreed, she was right. So for me, if I was a teacher, what I'd be looking out for is I'd be looking for perfectionistic behavior. I'd be looking at high levels of anxiety. One of the things that I talk about a lot is I talk about, okay, well, let's talk about ADHD for a second, just ADHD. We take a boy, he gets a homework task. He maybe procrastinates, he knows it's due, he doesn't do what he's supposed to do, but the part about the societal expectations isn't necessarily there, and he's more likely to turn up to the teacher the next day and not have it done. More likely, but obviously that's more of an externalized presentation. When we're talking about internalizing, and I've got a boy internalizer too, so when I talk about girls, I understand there's boys too. I've got a boy and a girl with exactly the same personality. They're both high level internalizers. So they would both arrive, but when they would arrive, they would have probably tapped me on the shoulder at 8 o'clock, had a breakdown, burst into tears, forced me to do it with them for 2 hours, and then arrive the next day, all showered, looking great, and hand the project in with absolutely no kerfuffle at all. And the teacher would never know there was a problem. Then the parent arrives in and they're like, all through this year, I've been doing this scaffolding. The teacher doesn't see any of it. So the other thing I would look for as well as a teacher would be around shutdowns versus meltdowns. Do you cover that a lot already, Sue?
No, good to recap, because it's more for people who do my courses. So I would love you to share my podcast community, because I haven't talked about it for a while. Yeah.
I'm just going to go super overview. Yeah. But if we look at externalizing and internalizers, and this is where a lot of people talk about boys and girls. Boys are more likely to, they might hit somebody or disrupt somebody to get to leave the classroom. And I have one of those too. So it's always fun going to his parent teachers. So they are more likely to overtly melt down. And you can see it, it's obvious, and sometimes it requires you to evacuate a classroom. It can be dangerous. It's difficult to know what you're going to get there. but it's definitely happening. You cannot ignore it. The other side would be a shutdown. So for example, this is just an example of my daughter. So last year she's in grade 3 and she has a great relationship with the teacher. And the teacher said to me, the parent teacher, the only thing that she could really pinpoint, because my daughter was already diagnosed, which the only thing that she could ever pinpoint was that at times there would be one thing that would happen and my daughter would sit at the desk very quietly with her head down, looking at the paper, but not writing. And if the teacher's aide came over, the teacher came over, they would come and check on her, and she would actually lose all skills to read, write, do anything at all. And she would sit there for sometimes 15, 20 minutes. They would try and move her. They would try to get her up, and she was just not moving. She couldn't move forward. And then she would be, at the end of this, they'd put her in the sensory tent. She'd lay down. She'd have to have a rest. And she would be emotionally exhausted. And I said to the teacher, can you just ring me? Because I'll just come get her. But they thought for a while that she was not participating. She was not trying. And it wasn't about that at all. And my son, the internalizer boy, does that as well. He will sit down with his head and you just don't notice him. He camouflages. He's terrified that someone will come up to him. And it's these kind of moments where I wondered 20, 30 years ago, were we diagnosing epilepsy, that this maybe looked like a seizure.
I was just going to say, sorry to jump in there, but
Totally.
I was going to say, I remember, because I've been around for 35 years, I remember where we often used to think the children were having petty mouths. And now I know that they're shut down. So just back on that, because I think teachers would want to know, because what you've described exactly, I've seen it hundreds of times, and I'm sure teachers can relate to that, where the child's actually frozen, and often that exhaustion after, exactly like a seizure, where a child often sleeps or whatever, or acts like it didn't even happen, right? Doesn't even remember that they were stuck there for 20 minutes, right?
Totally. Or is so embarrassed, they're just wanting it to be over.
Yes. So for both your son and daughter who internalizes, though, as a teacher, I don't want a child to get to that point. So A, what do you think can cause it? But B, as a teacher, what should I be looking for? Because I'm all about proactive, not reactive. So what am I going to be looking for to ensure that your daughter and son don't end up in this distress, really, even though it's not hitting someone distress? Yeah.
Totally. However, first step, I think, is always the diagnosis. So if you have a parent and a teacher that knows what they're looking for, right? So if we go back to the beginning, which is where I diverted, I'm sorry, is if we go back to the meltdown versus shutdown in a classroom, perfectionistic behavior, we look at camouflaging and covering up. Also, for example, my daughter recently told me that she has got really bad comprehension. We got it tested. She's 9. It said she's actually a 5-year-old level because she's just been covering up and pretending that she knows what's going on. So we're looking at some of these traits. I think socially, we really need to open up our eyes with internalizing and autism in girls, because if I had $1 for every time I talked to a parent who talked about sensory issues, social anxiety, and then ADHD. And I get a bit frustrated because I just think, well, at what point do we just say the autism word? Because it's not a dirty word and we just need to have a look at it. So I think if we looked at, like, for example, the swimming, my daughter went to swimming today. It was a whole thing around getting wet. We look at sensory, we look at anxiety, social, and it's not about not having eye contact or not knowing how to play. It's also about extremely helpful behavior. And it's about not knowing what to do, so playing a role. I will work at the sick bay. I will help pack up. I will pick up rubbish. I will assist this child that's disabled. The amount of autistic girls that I see that go and get the children with diabetes that need to go down to the sick bay, they help them. This kind, caring nature often is because they don't know what to do in the playground. So I think we need to just open up our eyes a little bit more around what could we see, or even talk to the parent about what they see, what their child says, and then even have a checklist of what can I look for to write something down in this teacher's report to the PED. There's so many parents that get stuck because they just don't have a third party that's seeing anything, and no one expects a teacher to say something that's not true. However, I also, as a teacher, if you cannot find anything to write and you're like, I've got nothing, I reckon you're better off just going to the parent and going, can you just tell them that I'm not willing to do it because I don't want to put nothing on mine which will actually bring down the report. Is there a babysitter? Is there another third party? Is there a gymnastics coach? If I can't put anything helpful down, maybe just leave me out, because it can really make it difficult to assess when you've got someone that's got 0 on there. Do you agree with that, Sue?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I know as a teacher, when we have children who are masking or camouflaging, that it can be so hard because, as you said earlier, we have 30 kids in the class. So
totally
very hard then to be asked to fill that in. But just back on a couple of things you've said that I couldn't agree more with. Number one, most people have heard me say it's all about ruling it out. So teachers, I think for teachers, when you're filling in that form, there is nothing wrong with saying, look, I really think the parents should rule this out. I haven't seen behaviours, but I think they might have, because you just talked about a few things. With the girls, number one, the hyperlexia, the reading and the comprehension not matching. So like that, who would have thought sending to the psychologist, okay, this child's a very proficient reader, but actually can't comprehend it. So so that actually would be helpful. It would also be helpful to know, oh, she's playing with the year sixes and she's in prep, or she's, like she's not playing with her peers. See, for me, that's a sign of a girl on the spectrum. She's a perfectionist, but also checks in all the time with me, or even maybe has a child who, if they're away, her world falls apart. She co-regulates with another child in my class. So I think teachers mightn't look at them as the markers, but for me, they are all the markers that should be sent. So I'm just putting teacher hat on, what you just described, and saying, actually, all of those things you said about the daughter would be in the report. I don't see the shutdown or meltdown, but I see all these signs of an autistic girl in my classroom. And I always say when I talk to parents, well, how does your child react when you're not home? And the teachers need to write, how would the child react when their teacher's away? Because some of my girls can't mask that day.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think as well, we also have to look at this idea around leadership. And I think there is just so many autistic girls that sit around leadership. And leadership, it can be looking like helpful, kind, leader. Yeah, is it? Or is it a black and white thinking and inflexible attitude, and that I am going this way, come with me or don't? And it's that people talk about it being confident and really positive. However, I would say though, are they able to problem solve? If they say we're going to play hide and seek and goes, no, we're not going to play that, and she just goes off by herself to the library because she can't problem solve, we'll play your game first and then mine next. It's like, is that confident? Is this mini prime minister that everyone talks about? Or is this a child that can't problem solve and so just opts out when it gets hard?
No, 100%. And it's funny, on my new executive function course, which Dean Beadle is the presenter for, Dean talks about he has autism too, and he went into a classroom, was asked to observe a student who was highly anxious. And he went up to the teacher at the end of the session and went, he's not your most anxious child. This other child's your most anxious child. And the teacher's like, what do you mean? He doesn't even have a diagnosis. Dean's like, that child was checking in with you every activity. They checked in to make sure it was okay. They were constantly checking in. They were checking on other children. They were worried about everyone else. They were hypervigilant. They come across as a good child, but they're hypervigilant. Actually, this child needs more support than the one I came to watch, who's actually getting a lot of support. These are the ones that camouflaging and go under the radar. And I think once I talk to teachers about it, they're like, oh, I didn't realize that was a girl, because like me, we didn't learn about autism at uni, or we might have learned what it is, but we didn't learn about the girls and the ADHD girls. So this is where it's so valuable what you're sharing there, and particularly that believing the parents. I have a big problem with get that piece too, with the girls and the boys sometimes, when the parents say they have the big meltdown at home, actually getting teachers to understand, yeah, actually, you've got to listen to that.
Yeah, it's funny because if you look at it from a parent point of view, and obviously all I do is parents, right? And I haven't found a parent yet who has gone down this road hard, spent all the money, the time, the resources for no reason. I haven't seen it. And obviously we're talking about, there can be their own mental health concerns. I think that you would be able to see them as a teacher. And then you'd be looking at the child and it may be different, but that would be very much the exception. This road that parents go down with these kids, not a good road. It is not a happy road. You don't get anything from it as a parent. Even if you get the NDIS funding, which people talk about, you know, you're doing it for an NDIS funding. So to what? Cover the basics of some therapies that you desperately need. There's no income. There's no payment that you're getting there. So unless the parent has significant mental health issues, I just don't see them doing this for no reason. I don't. But in saying that, from the teacher's point of view, I would much rather be a parent than a teacher. The teachers have got the hardest job in the country. I can't even imagine being a teacher. But so that's what I'd probably be looking at. And I think the confirmation that you talked about is really valuable too. That extra confirming, and also the analysis paralysis. I've seen a lot of kids be unable to get started at anything. Like they won't write a letter for fear of getting it wrong. They won't read out loud. And that there is in internalizing autism ADHD, you know, that's just anxiety straight.
I know I'll have teachers and teacher aides listening and educators going, well, okay, Jane, what can I do to help this child? Because I really want to help them. What are some things I can do so they don't internalize and camouflage? What can I do to support this child in my classroom?
Okay, and I'm not an educator. I'm a very, very nerdy scientist. And I am so conscious that I don't want to make, it's kind of like in parenting where people go, just take them aside and talk to them for 4 minutes. I was like, well, that's cool if you don't have siblings and a job and other things to do. So I want to first off and say that you got very, very little time and you got a lot of kids. So, but I think there's some real credit in saying everything 3 times and going repetition for everybody. In terms of, like I have 3 children on the NDIS, I have 3 children with IEPs. And what for me is so important, I say to the parents, is try your best. And I know it's difficult to try and get a teacher that you think will work well with your kid, because 50% of the work is done if they have a connection. I reckon I do barely anything at the school that I'm at because I've got a good school and I've got some great teachers that I work with and I trust them. If you can build a relationship with the parent on trust, I will back that teacher every step of the way. And I do that with my kids. This is not the teacher this, the teacher that. If I trust that teacher, I'm going to say, well, hang on a second, what were you doing? And I think if you build that relationship between the parent and the teacher, and I have had teachers that I don't personally like, and I'm sure teachers have not always personally liked me either. However, for the greater good, I always say to parents, connect with the teacher regardless, because they are very, very important. Even if you're finding the parent a little difficult, try your best to build trust with them, because I think if they can feel more at ease, they're going to be looking for what's going right, not what's going wrong. I also as well say to parents, talk about what's going great. So you as the parent, you do not want to have an air about you that you're picking. This is not a place to be picking, I always say to parents, and try to be as positive as possible. If when I see good stuff happen, email the teacher, something great happened today. I'm seeing this, it's going awesome. Show that you can be happy and talk about expectations going forward. Like, I only want you to ring me if this is going on, or I'm not saying anything because things are going great. So maybe set up expectations around communication if the parent is being a little bit overtly or hypervigilant. I would say from a parent point of view, they're probably doing that because they feel really uneasy. And is there anything that you can do to make the parent feel a little bit more at ease? Because they will be easy to deal with if they're feeling better. Yeah. So I would be putting the parent to ease as much as possible. And I always say to the parent, put the teacher at ease wherever you can, build that relationship. Yeah. I think from there, I would always, I suppose the 3 saying things 3 times, I think really helps. And also I try to talk to teachers more around making accommodation for the classroom, not the child. I don't ask teachers to make individual accommodations for my children. I do not do this. But I do say, hey, is there a way that they can all have a break, or when are the breaks? And because I don't think it's only the diagnosed children that deserve some little accommodations, what about the kids that have got parents divorcing or they've got trauma? Like, why is it all about you've got to have a diagnosis to get some little tiny adjustment? Can we not make it better for everyone? So for me, I'd be more looking around what can we do for all the kids to regulate everybody so it's not so chaotic? And that's probably more where I sit, because when they talk to me about individual accommodations, I say I don't want any. I don't want the teacher to be doing individual accommodations. What can we do to make everybody have a better day is probably more where I come from.
Yeah, I love that. In fact, I was just thinking about one of the little boys, Edward, in my ultimate guide to school and home, where his veneer of coping and holding it together was around that the phys ed teacher did the captain's pick, and he would always get left to last, right? And so we worked out on the days he had phys ed, he was having these big meltdowns. And it was that anxiety standing in the line, wanting to be picked, can you imagine? But the phys ed teacher saw no anxiety. Anyway, the beautiful phys ed teacher, he actually, the days of phys ed, had a whiteboard he'd put in his window of his classroom so that my student could see which group he was going to be in. There was no more captain pick. But what's shocked the phys ed teacher, all the kids went past to look. It wasn't just him that had that anxiety standing in the line. So that is a classic accommodation that actually went in place for one child, but actually had a massive impact on all the children. Because for my children who mask, in my experience, it's often the social anxiety. And so knowing where they belong really makes a difference. And I would always say giving them a sense of belonging in my classroom by giving them a job or a high status job to create connection, but also every kid in the class likes a job, As you say, I don't think these are hard. I think all kids can have these accommodations. But I think when we've got children who are masking and camouflaging, we tend to sort of go, well, I don't see it. What can I do? But what I've found over the years is just try a few different things like that. Start to observe, is it that perfectionist child? So maybe having a subtle system to ask for help, or like, what are the things that I can do or the parent are reporting causing the stress that I can actually put in place for the whole class? And I love that. That's so much easier than trying to have 30.
Oh, totally. I'm just trying to imagine if everyone has 2 or 3 accommodation, you've got 30 kids. It blows my mind, which is why I thought, well, could we just make it more regulated for everybody?
Yeah.
And take the pressure off.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we don't need to worry about who's masking, who's not, who's camouflaging when we're talking about just running the day, because they all receive the same accommodations. But look, I think there's a teacher-student ratio issue really at play, which is a whole nother thing. I don't want to
exactly. Let's not go there because we're drawing to the end of the podcast, Jane. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I will link to your page and all your other podcasts because it's a wealth of information there. And, thank you for sharing about your children and yourself. Before we finish, I just want to loop back to your 14-year-old self. What would have helped your 14-year-old self not get such autistic burnout? Because I have a lot of secondary school teachers who listen.
For me, this is why I run this podcast, is because I talk about diagnosis. And with my children, I talk about building self-awareness. There's no magic pill for autism. People would debate to say that ADHD can be medicated, but it doesn't change you. You still have to do things differently. So for me, I think diagnosis is key. And if you are aware of how your brain works, you would be aware that it should be worked differently. So, for example, I wouldn't have done a 45-minute bus drive into a hugely far away school. Possibly I would have gone to the one 5 minutes up the road and walked home. That one tiny little thing would have made a massive difference in my time of load. I remember shutting down on a school bus. I couldn't speak or move. Didn't know what was going on with me. So I think when the teachers would come out and try and figure out what was going on with me, and there was probably out of a really good way, I think I was so probably far gone by the time that anyone checked on me, I didn't even know what was what. But I think there's a bit of a funny one around parents as well, and around confidentiality. That can be really tricky with teenagers, because they don't know where that conversation is going to go. So maybe stating that up front, because I was always terrified. They'd come in and kind of go, what's going on with you? Are you okay? And I would never know where that information would go.
Yes.
So I think probably stating around where that information goes, what you tell me is this, I will do it with this, and this. Or if you just say this is completely private. I think the confidentiality, probably when you're a child or a young adult, you don't necessarily understand that.
No,
I think it would have opened up if I
vulnerability.
had have known what the confidentiality was.
And I always say with especially my boys on the spectrum, but I think it's true of the girls, like if you need to talk to that child, don't come and get them from the classroom because every other teenager is going to see them taken out. Send them on a job and then the psychologist might bump into them, or that, like, I call it non-threatening withdrawal, because just an adult turning up as a teenager is quite threatening. So thinking how you can be more subtle in and I always think a walk is better for a teenager, a bit like teaching them to drive. They're better off when you're parallel playing rather than
totally
in their face. Yeah. So having a walk around and chatting rather than sitting them down in an office. I mean, that in itself would make some of my children camouflage. So trying to find those ways to connect with teenagers, but putting that teenage fear of confidentiality, of other children noticing, like, how do you wrap that up? Because I think that then creates another level of anxiety. So thank you so much. Oh my goodness, we could talk all day, Jane, but I really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. And you know what? True to form, Sue, I'm just going to add one really quick thing.
Yeah,
I have spoken to so many autistic girls who have gone to a library at school as a teenager and looked up the DSM-5 and diagnosed themselves as autistic. So maybe if you've got a library, leave your autism and ADHD books there and let people find their own path, and they can go back to their parent if they need to and say, I think I have this. I think having those books readily available is always a good thing too.
Well, I personally think we have all these books on sexuality. We have all these books on religion, where we should have more books on neurodiversity, just like all those books are available. Every school should have these books out and free for the children to look at and read about, but also when they see it in other children, they can support it. So I really believe we should have all these, like, can I tell you about PDA? Can I tell you about ADHD? Like all my favorites from my website. But why aren't they just sitting out in the library?
That's what I mean. So if we're relying on the parent and the teacher, well, how about we just give the child the book and let them read it?
Yeah. And like one of my little boys, All Cats Have Asperger's. It's changed its name now.
I love that book. I've got it at home.
Yeah. So he's like, I do that one. I don't do that one. I do this one. I used to do that one. And then he's like, yeah, I think I am like a cat. And I think I probably have Asperger's. It's like, yes, because his logical brain told him this is all me, and how empowering. How empowering. So I
didn't even realize I was autistic until I read that book, All Kids Have Autism. I read it, I was like, oh my God, I have that.
Love it. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And I know this will be really valuable for everyone who listens to it.
Thank you, Sue. Bye.
I hope you got some great insights and understanding to our girls who camouflage and mask, and maybe have had an opportunity to reflect on girls you've known in the past who may have been very much like Jane explained during this podcast. Don't forget to jump on now and register for January 24th or February 5th. If those dates don't work for you, of course, you can do my online on-demand course anytime, anywhere, 5 hours if you're in New South Wales or ACT accredited training. Or everyone, of course, you get a certificate, and whatever state you're in, it's all accredited in your state, but they have specific rules in those states. But I would love you to start 2025 teaching you with tools and strategies, because more and more teachers are teaching in complex classroom, busy classroom, and looking for strategies to support children. So jump on, enroll for online on demand, or join me for the live virtual.